Please be aware this podcast contains descriptions from the court case of graphic violence inflicted on the victims. Listeners are asked to exercise discretion. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. As morning broke in the town of Rotherham, a place with a population of over 110,000 people and a proud industrial past, people were waking up and getting ready to go to work. It was the 19th of September 2022, and as the first morning commuters walked through the town centre, one or two started to slow down and eventually stopped. There was a man lying on the ground. He had no shoes or socks on and his body was covered in deep cuts and blackening bruises. His skin was scalded with reddening burns and one of his limbs looked as though it was at a strange angle to his body. He couldn't move. All he could do was occasionally groan through the pain. But at least he was alive. An ambulance crew arrived and when they got there, they were shocked by what they saw. Rarely did they see such severe injuries, especially to someone who, by all means, hadn't been involved in a car crash that they could see. And he was alive and just in the middle of the street. This was incredibly confusing. The signs were that the injuries had been inflicted over a period of time and they had been severe, made with various different types of weapons. It looked as though the man had been tortured. He had suffered various injuries, including lacerations to his liver caused by severe blunt force trauma. He would be spending a lot of time in hospital. It was touch and go. At about the same time, the police were called to 41 Spring Street, an area where there were mainly Victorian terraced houses and flats near the centre of the town, after a report came in of concern for a man. The house, apparently deserted, was dark inside and there were tatty curtains covering the windows, not completely. They had burn holes in them and rips, and so inside it was a really dull sort of grey colour and it smelled of smoke. And as far as the officers entering could see, there was no one around. The police had forced entry, and once they were inside, they got further into the house and eventually ended up in the dining room. Lying naked in a sleeping bag with a rag wrapped around his arm to cover the cuts on him was 31-year-old Adam Clapham, a family man and a father of a 7-year-old child. The police officers tried to revive Adam, even though his body, covered in the same deep cuts, bruises and burns as the man found in the town centre, was unresponsive. Adam looked in an even worse state, with severe lacerations to his head and face, and his skull looked as though it was crushed in places. Adam had been tortured, although this time it had been taken to the extreme. He was confirmed dead at the scene. Earlier that day, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, the man who was found in Rotherham Centre a little while later called his usual drug dealer, Tony, to organise a pickup. He needed some recreational drugs. I'm going to refer to the man who was found in Rotherham Town Centre as just that, the man, and that's because he was granted a lifetime anonymity by the courts. And so this man called Tony, whose real name was Arab Yusuf, and Tony sounded strange. He was on edge and annoyed as they talked on the phone. But the pickup was arranged as normal to be collected from Spring Street, one of the houses that Tony used to supply drugs to users around the Rotherham area. The man knocked on the door and after a while it opened up, and to his surprise, Tony wasn't alone. There were other people there with him. There were 4 men: Robert Crooks, Kieran Miller, Mohammed Ashraf, a youth aged 16, and also there was a woman, Lynette Myers, who he knew as another drug user who also bought drugs from Tony. This looked threatening, so the man turned to go, but he was grabbed by the 4 men and dragged inside. The front door was slammed shut with no means of escaping, and the 4 men stood between him and the door. They pushed the man towards the staircase that led down to the basement, and they pushed him, and the man fell backwards down all of the stairs and landed at the bottom of that staircase. The 4 men followed, laughing as they passed him, and when they were all standing around him, they started kicking him. One of the men, who was carrying a hammer, asked, quote, "Where's Adam?" The man said he didn't know where Adam was. Now, Adam was his friend. He was another drug user, and he sometimes looked after that Spring Street house for Tony. But the man was adamant he didn't know where Adam was. The men kept asking, "Where's Adam? Where's Adam? Where's Adam?" And they were becoming more and more intimidating as they were doing this. But the man kept saying he just didn't know. He wasn't lying to them. He just didn't know where Adam was. They asked again, and this time when he said he didn't know, Tony brought the hammer up and then he hit the man as hard as he could on his back. They asked him again and he still couldn't give them the answer, so they continued hitting him with that hammer. Eventually they stopped because they realised that this wasn't going to get an answer from him, and then Robert and Kieran took a rope, tied it around him and restrained him. They used a washing line to tie his legs to the radiator, but he was kicking so much trying to escape that eventually it pulled the radiator off the wall, and this caused the men to laugh even more, and they began again kicking him. Then Robert went upstairs and the rest of the men continued their savage attack on the man. When Robert did eventually come back into the room, now he was carrying a number of glass bottles and he handed them to the other men in the room so that they had one each. One of the men, Tony, then walked over to where the man was lying and he smashed one of those bottles on his head, and then the other men that were standing around all followed suit. They came up to him with their bottles in hand and did exactly the same thing on different parts of his body. By this point, the man was covered in cuts from the glass and had various different head injuries from the force of it as well. All the time, the woman there was laughing at what was happening, and she was also participating in the attack, and the other men were stood around laughing, all the while asking, "Where's Adam?" One of the men then grabbed a cigarette packet out of his pocket. He lit up one cigarette and he handed them round to the other people in the room as well. And at this point, it wasn't exactly clear what they were going to do, and the man would later say that he thought and hoped they were just going to have a smoke. Maybe he'd even get a smoke at some point too, but of course that didn't happen. And instead, one by one, they took their lit cigarettes and stubbed them out on the man's body and on his face. Now, they might have been enjoying doing this torture. It was reported that they were all laughing throughout this and seemingly having a very good time, but they were no closer to getting the information that they needed, and ultimately the reason they were doing this, to get information as to where Adam was at. They decided that they needed to change tactics, and that's when Tony turned to Kieran and Mohammed and started whispering to them so that the man couldn't hear. And then after a few minutes of them talking, Kieran and Mohammed went up the stairs and out of the room. Robert and Lynette then grabbed the man, also pulled him up and then up the stairs and out of the basement, and they took him to the nearby bathroom where they placed him in the bath. The man was likely slightly relieved that it was him and just two others now, and the fact that one of them was Lynette. He knew Lynette as a fellow drug user. She wasn't part of this gang that had been created, or at least he didn't think she was, and so he may have believed that this would be a good thing for him. They'd seen each other about, they knew of each other, they had the same supplier of drugs, there was a common ground here. Rob walked out of the bathroom and then the man was left there alone with Lynette, and he turned to her and he pleaded, quote, "Lynette, please help me." Lynette closed the bathroom door, looked at him in the eyes, and then she raised a bottle up and smashed it onto his head. She then turned on the shower to its coldest setting and watched as the water poured over the man, and then she picked up a metal bar that was nearby and she started beating the man with it all over his body. As she was doing this, she told him she was trying to help him. Quote, "If I don't do it, they're going to do it 10 times harder." She might be right, but she was also enjoying inflicting violence and seeing his pain. Then the man heard Rob come back upstairs and he was shouting now, quote, let me get at him, let me do it. But Lynette said, "No, I'll do it, I'll sort it." Lynette kept him in the bathroom, occasionally switching methods. So at some point she'd be hitting him with that metal bar, and at other points she'd use another bottle and smash it over his head. And then, in the midst of these beatings, there was a break of about 20 minutes and the man heard the front door open and he heard someone being brought in and taken downstairs to the basement where he'd just been moments earlier. The man thought perhaps Kieran and Mohammed had brought someone with them. He assumed that Tony had said there were these few places that they could search for Adam. They'd gone and looked, found him and brought him back to the house. But Lynette Myers did not stop beating the man, even though at this point Adam had been found, and instead she upped the severity and the frequency of the attacks, perhaps doing this because she wanted to get in more before she knew she'd have to stop. She kept up this torture for another 25 minutes, and she only stopped when they heard a scream from a panicked Adam down in the basement. The man decided he had to try and escape. These people were totally brutal, completely out of control, high and drunk, and so he knew that he had to do something to try and escape. So he lunged for the door, attempting to grab it, but Lynette was too quick for him. She grabbed him, pulled him back, and by now he's incredibly weak from these attacks that he's been having happen to him over and over again. And Lynette also called for the other men to come and help her. She shouted for them to come and get the man and bring him downstairs with Adam. Tony and Rob appeared at the door to the bathroom. They were going to take him downstairs into the basement again, where the screaming was coming from, and again he was pushed down those stairs and landed at the bottom. He looked up expecting to see Adam, but he didn't recognise the other person in the basement at first. He saw a body tied up, slouching in the chair, and the body was naked and covered in blood. This man was in a bad way. He was in so much pain he couldn't talk, but gradually the man who was looking over at this bloody figure did eventually managed to see that it definitely was Adam, and he was in a really, really bad way. They started laying into Adam again with the hammer, and the blood started to flow, and Kieran was shouting enthusiastically, trying to rile the other people up to keep going with the attack. Then Robert tied the man up next to Adam, and then he went upstairs to the kitchen. The rest of the people in that room started to hit and kick Adam, smashing glass bottles on him again. But the man noticed that these attacks were much more intense and severe than what had happened to him when he was first in the basement. He knew that Adam was in real trouble. As this was going on, the whole time Tony was asking Adam where the money was, and that's when the man started to understand what this was all really about. He had come to Spring Street yesterday to see Adam, who was minding that Spring Street house. Adam and the man popped out to go to the corner shop to get a couple of lagers, and whilst they were out they left the door ajar so that they could get back in. When they got back, they realised that £300 that had been given to them earlier for a drug deal had been taken. It was nowhere around the house that they could find. And so the man realised that that's what this was all about. All this violence was about £300. Or maybe it was more than that. It was perhaps because Tony had felt embarrassed. He was humiliated that one of his own had left the door open to the house and someone had just come in and taken the money. Either way, it was a message, and the torture continued. Tony's cousin Mohammed came up with what he thought was a hilarious idea. He suggested that Adam and the man give each other oral sex as a joke, and that they film it and post it. Tony and everyone else thought it was a great idea, quote, yeah, make them. So Tony told both the men to take their clothes off. Neither Adam or the man had a choice. Every time they said no, they'd get another hit to their body, and that's when Tony went over to a drawer and he pulled out a machete. Tony walked over to Adam and held it close at his throat. The man would later tell police that he would have done anything to get out of this. The two men were forced to perform a sex act on each other, which Mohammed and the 16-year-old filmed. They then turned the phone around so it was recording them, and now it was recording all of the men and Lynette, and they were laughing about what was happening. The man said that the abuse lasted about 10 minutes, and then Adam keeled over and crashed to the ground. The man then passed out, and hours later, when he came back to, he noticed that some of the blood had been attempted to clear up, and Adam wasn't in the room. It turned out he'd been moved upstairs to the dining room. When the man came to, he looked up and Tony was there standing over him, and he was telling the man that he would need to go to the police and tell them that Adam had died of an overdose. Tony left, and the man crawled to the top of the basement steps before becoming unconscious again, and when he came to, no one was around. He managed to stand up unsteadily, and he shuffled towards the front door, which was a little bit open, and actually managed to get outside. He was terrified through this whole getting up to the top of the basement stairs and then finally out the door, that the people who had done this to him and Adam might still be around, and if they caught him trying to leave the house, they would kill him. But thankfully they weren't there. In fact, the house was completely deserted, and so he did manage to escape. That's when he staggered through the town centre onto the floor and then fell unconscious and was found by passers-by on their way to work in the morning. The man was in a really bad way. Medical staff worked really hard and they did manage to get the man to a stable point, and so he was able to talk to police and tell them exactly what had happened. The man didn't lie and tell them what Tony had said to do, which was to say that Adam had died from an overdose. Instead, he told them exactly what had happened. And when the police went to search the house, they found ample forensic evidence there. And so with that, with the man's account of what had happened and CCTV, they were able to start putting their case together and start looking to arrest the people who were involved. From the 23rd of September, police started to pick up the suspects one by one, and eventually they did have all 6 in custody, and all 6 of them pleaded not guilty to what had happened. They completely denied that this had happened, and so their case went to trial. Robert, Lynette and the 16-year-old were all charged with murder and false imprisonment, rape and grievous bodily harm. Mohammed, Arab or Tony, were both charged with murder, wounding with intent to do grievous bodily harm, false imprisonment and rape. Kieran was charged with murder, Section 18 grievous bodily harm, false imprisonment and causing a male to engage in sexual activity. The trial started on March 20th, 2023, and it was found that Adam had died from brain damage as well as blood loss from blunt force trauma to the head, probably punches, kicks or stamps, and the use of more than one weapon. The court heard that a neuropathologist said that Adam might have survived for more than half an hour after sustaining the injury, but it was unlikely he would have survived beyond around 2 hours. Adam had 52 head injuries and 162 injuries to other parts of his body, including his torso and limbs, and it only took a short time for the jury to reach their verdict on the accused. Lynette Myers, on the charges of grievous bodily harm with intent and false imprisonment, was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years. The 16-year-old, on the same charges and rape, was found guilty and he was sentenced to a minimum term of 21 years in prison. Mohammed Ashraf, on the same charges, was found guilty and given a life sentence with a minimum term of 28 years. Kieran Miller, on the charges of murder, Section 18 assault and false imprisonment, was also found guilty. He was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. Robert Crooks, on charges of murder, causing grievous bodily harm with intent, false imprisonment and rape, was found guilty, given a life sentence and had a minimum term of 37 years. And Arab Yusuf, or the man known as Tony, he was charged on murder, rape, false imprisonment and Section 18 assault. He was found guilty and given a life sentence with a minimum term of 39 years. Cheers and shouts of yes were heard from the public gallery. Quote, "On your own admission, you were a drug dealer, and I have no doubt you supplied drugs to both your victims and others. I have no doubt you were the principal ringleader in relation to what happened that evening and the originator that led to this plan and that led to this devastation. I'm sure you were the person aggrieved by the money going missing, and you were the person who decided on the plan to intimidate the man and capture Adam Clapham. You show no remorse or insight into the catastrophic harm you've caused. And on the phone, you were seen rejoicing in the pain and humiliation you were subjecting your victims to. You tried to get your victim to provide a false statement to officers about what had occurred." Adam had his problems with drugs, but he was also a loving father and he had family and friends. Adam and his ex-partner, the mother of his child, had grown up in the Woodlands area of Doncaster. She helped Adam to get a flat in Rotherham where he'd been living for around 4 months. Adam enjoyed listening to music and was into cars, and he was known around town as a gentle giant. He worked for DFS as a delivery driver, and although he and his partner had broken up around a year before, they were in the process of getting back together and they loved each other very much. Following his death, a vigil was held in Spring Street in Rotherham and a second one in Doncaster, and tributes flooded in for him on social media and also in person. Quote, "Adam was one of the nicest lads, and rip Adam, how sad. He was the kindest soul ever. Poor lad wouldn't harm a fly. Thoughts are with his family. And rest in peace, Adam, very shocked to hear. The second victim of the attacks, who we referred to throughout this episode as the man, said, quote, "What has been said about what has happened, people will form their own opinions of what type of people me and Adam are or were. What happened to me was horrific. What happened to Adam was worse. Whatever people think of us, we did not deserve that, and no one does." At the end of the evidence and before the verdict was read, Adam's mum said this, quote, "He had his basic human rights violated, and the circumstances of his death will forever be in my thoughts. The sad fact is he didn't wake up and never will. I was unable to hold Adam, even his hand. This broke me. He leaves behind a 7-year-old child who he will never see develop into a young woman, get married or have children of her own. Adam also leaves behind a loving sister, father and several nieces and nephews who are devastated. We as a family are still trying to come to terms with what happened. I doubt we ever will. Adam, we love you, always have, always will, and until we meet again, you will forever be in our hearts." Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. A huge thanks to our guest writer who helped with this episode. And also, just to let you guys know that we now offer membership levels on YouTube. We also offer a slightly cheaper alternative on Patreon. I'll leave the link to that in the description box below. That offers things like early release episodes and other perks like that. So feel free to check those out. I'd really appreciate it if you're able to support me to keep creating this Red Rum content. Also, if you're not subscribed, please click that subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button. And I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.